In every forgotten town, there are houses that never stop whispering. Some carry the weight of untold pain. Others hide secrets so deeply buried that even time hesitates to disturb them. But sometimes, the past chooses its own moment to rise again. Now imagine a woman who has endured half a century of chains, silence, and loss, stepping into a place abandoned by the world, hoping to rebuild her life. What she found inside was not peace, but something that never should have survived. She had lived through half a century of chains, yet the world never once asked her what those 50 years felt like. To those who passed her on the road, she looked like any other quiet old widow, wrapped in a faded shawl, carrying a small sack of belongings and the kind of silence that comes only from surviving things too heavy to speak aloud. But behind her calm eyes lived memories carved deep, memories that were not simply painful, but shaped out of a lifetime stolen from her. Every scar on her hands was a calendar of days she had survived. Every tremor in her voice was a reminder of nights when she prayed simply to see the morning again. Even after freedom came, she often caught herself waking before dawn, sitting upright in bed as if waiting for a command, her breath tight, her fingers curled in the sheets as though they were still tied to the coarse rope of her past. Freedom, for her, did not arrive with celebration or joy. It came quietly, like a distant bird call in the fog. One day she was property, and the next day she was a widow with no one left to own her, no one left to punish her, no one left to share the heavy silence she carried. Her husband, the only person who ever whispered hope into her bones, had died years before freedom reached them. She often imagined what he would have said had he lived to see her walking on a road with no overseer behind her. She imagined he would have told her that the world was bigger than she had ever been allowed to believe, that she deserved a place where her name was not spoken only when someone needed something from her. But imagination was all she had left of him, and so she walked alone, each footstep carrying her farther from the fields where her life had been spent, farther from the graves she could not bear to look back at, farther from the name she was forced to answer to. She did not know exactly what freedom meant. To many, it meant opportunity or wealth or new beginnings. To her, it meant breath. It meant waking without fear. It meant stepping where she wished, even if those steps led only to more uncertainty. She carried no expectations, only a quiet determination not to die in the same soil that had watched her suffer. She had no children to follow, no kin to seek, no letters to guide her. All she had was a small pouch of coins earned from years of labor after freedom was declared. Coins she kept wrapped in cloth and tied close to her chest as though losing them would somehow steal her hard-won autonomy. She had told herself she would not spend those coins unless it was on something that belonged to her alone, something that reminded her she no longer existed at the mercy of another. As she traveled from town to town, she watched people's eyes shift when they saw her. Some looked at her with pity, others with discomfort, a few with silent hostility. She had grown accustomed to the weight of their stares. They were nothing compared to the weight she had carried all her life, but every so often she would pass a house where curtains twitched or someone would cross the street rather than share the same path with her. She told herself it did not matter. She had endured worse than sidelong glances and whispered conversations. She kept her gaze steady, her shoulders straight, and her steps firm. She was a woman who had survived what most would never understand, and she refused to let the smallness of others diminish the vastness of her resilience. It was only when she reached the outskirts of a quiet, fading town that she felt something shift inside her. The road was lined with trees that bent toward one another, forming arches of shadow that stretched across the dirt. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent she remembered faintly from childhood before life turned her memories into distant echoes. There were fewer people here, fewer whispers, fewer eyes tracking her movements. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though the land itself was giving her space to breathe. As she walked, she noticed a house standing alone at the far edge of the town, its roof sagging slightly, its windows clouded with dust. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, untouched by human hands for years, yet something about it called to her, not because it was beautiful or inviting, but because it looked like she felt, worn, weathered, but still standing. She approached the house slowly, almost reverently, running her fingers along the cracked wood of the gate. She imagined herself inside, sitting in a room where no one shouted her name in anger, no one demanded anything of her, no one held power over her body or her breath. She imagined a place where she could speak her husband's name without fear, where she could whisper her own story without being silenced, where she could simply exist without being watched, judged, or owned. And for the first time since freedom found her, she felt a spark of something fragile but real forming in her chest, something she had not allowed herself to feel in decades, the possibility of a beginning without chains. The house she chose stood at the edge of the town like a relic exiled from memory, a structure that seemed to hold itself together out of stubbornness rather than strength. Locals avoided even glancing at it. Their silence around it was thicker than fog, and she could sense an unspoken tension whenever she mentioned her interest in buying it. Yet despite the peeling paint, the warped porch, and the shutters clinging lopsided against the wind, she felt an undeniable pull toward it. It was as though her years of captivity had trained her to recognize spaces where suffering once lived, and this house, abandoned as it was, carried an aura that resonated with some part of her spirit that had learned to survive darkness without breaking. The townsfolk muttered about its past, but never fully. They spoke in fragments, in half-finished stories, their eyes darting to the corners of the room as if afraid something might hear them. Some said the family that once lived there had vanished without warning. Others insisted the house swallowed them. A few older residents would tighten their lips and refuse to say more, as though the past had grown teeth that could still bite. She listened quietly, her face still, her expression calm, as though she had not lived through horrors that would make most people tremble. Fear, to her, was not something born from rumors. Fear was the memory of chains cutting into her wrists, the hiss of an overseer's breath behind her, the sound of her husband being dragged away in the night. Compared to that, the stories about the house seemed distant, almost trivial. And yet, she did not dismiss them. There was a tone in the townspeople's voices that reminded her of the hushed warnings passed between the enslaved at night, the ones that spoke not of imagined dangers but of real threats lurking just beyond sight. She knew when people were hiding truth inside superstition. She walked around the house on her own, her hand brushing the wooden siding that had long ago surrendered to rot. Despite its decay, the place felt strangely intact, as though it resisted collapse with an invisible strength. The porch boards bowed under her weight, but did not break. The windows were dusty, but not shattered. The front door, though swollen from years of rain, remained firmly in its frame. With every step she took, she felt as though she were walking across the skin of something that had been asleep for too long. A chill traced her spine, but she did not turn away. There was something about the house's isolation that appealed to her. The field behind it, overgrown and unkempt, reminded her of the tall grass where she once hid to escape a particularly cruel overseer. The trees around it stood like silent guardians, their branches swaying in a rhythm that soothed her nerves. This was a place that had been abandoned by people, yes, but not by time. Time had continued to move around it, shaping it, aging it, leaving marks she understood all too well. When she entered the small office where property papers were kept, the clerk looked at her as if she were out of her mind. He hesitated before sliding the documents toward her, his fingers trembling slightly. He asked if she was sure. He reminded her of the whispers. He spoke of noises heard at night, of lights seen through broken windows, of the previous owner who tried renting the house only to flee town weeks later. She listened without interrupting him, her gaze steady, her hands folded neatly on the counter. When he finished, she nodded once. She had lived through worse than shadows behind windows. She had endured worse than sounds in the dark. What frightened others rarely frightened her anymore. She signed the papers with a steady hand. The townspeople watched her as she walked toward the house with the key in her palm, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and pity. Some murmured under their breath. A few crossed themselves. They believed she was stepping into danger, stepping into a place that had swallowed those before her. She felt their eyes on her back, but she did not quicken her pace. If anything, she slowed, taking in the ground beneath her feet, the creaking of the gate as she pushed it open, the whisper of the wind weaving through the broken shingles. She had known for years that the world carried secrets in its forgotten corners, and sometimes those secrets found people who were strong enough to face them. Perhaps that was why she felt drawn to the house more than fearfully repelled from it. was not a threat to her. It was a mirror, reflecting her own resilience, reflecting the years she had survived, reflecting the depths of her endurance in ways no polished, perfect home ever could. The violent, mysterious past attached to it only made her more curious, more certain that she was meant to uncover something buried within its walls. All her life, her choices had been stolen from her. Now she was choosing the one place everyone else had walked away from, and somewhere deep inside her, she felt the pull of a truth waiting patiently beneath the dust and shadows, determined to reveal itself only to someone who had known suffering long enough to understand it without fear. The first night in the abandoned house carried a stillness so thick it pressed against her chest, heavier than any chains she had known. The air smelled of dust and old wood, a scent that clung to the walls like a memory that refused to fade. She moved slowly through the dim hallways, her fingers brushing against the cracked plaster and warped doorframes as if seeking some connection to the souls that had once walked there. Every floorboard groaned beneath her weight, a warning whispered in low tones she could not ignore. She had spent her life listening for subtle signs of danger, the small changes in sound or shadow that might indicate someone was watching, someone waiting, and she realized that the house itself seemed alive in the same way. It responded to her presence with a mixture of hesitation and recognition, as if it remembered her before she had even crossed the threshold. The walls, lined with faded wallpaper patterned in swirls that had once been vibrant, seemed to close in at times and then open again, stretching wider in the corners of her eyes as though they were breathing along with her. As she moved deeper into the rooms, she noticed small details that had been hidden under layers of neglect. A chair left facing a wall, a table covered in dust but bearing the faint indentation of something once heavy, a cracked mirror reflecting her own wary gaze with subtle distortions that made her feel watched from behind. She could not explain why these objects drew her attention so strongly, why the house's emptiness seemed deliberate rather than accidental. It was as if the past residents had prepared the place for her arrival, leaving behind signs that only someone who had known suffering and loss could read. Each corner she turned revealed another trace of life long gone, yet oddly preserved. A handprint etched faintly into the wood, a scrap of fabric clinging stubbornly to a nail, the remnants of belongings carefully hidden, yet exposed in the most unexpected places. She understood instinctively that the house had not been empty, that it had been waiting, quietly storing the echoes of human presence for decades, and that now those echoes were stirring because she had finally come. Plain and terrifying, jars filled with what looked like soil, bones, and ash, carefully labeled in handwriting that had faded almost beyond recognition, and tools whose purpose was unclear but hinted at rituals or practices she could not name. The air here was cooler, heavier, and smelled of mildew mixed with something she could not identify, a metallic tang that made her stomach tighten. She realized that this room had been used repeatedly, not abandoned in haste, but maintained in secrecy. The sense of deliberate care in what had been left behind suggested that whoever had lived here had not simply vanished. They had intended to leave a message or preserve something, and she was now standing in the middle of their silent testament. The weight of their intent pressed on her, mingling with her own experiences, creating a strange sense of continuity between her life and the lives that had preceded her. As she explored the upper floors, the sunlight streaming through broken shutters caught on dust motes that seemed to float like tiny spirits. She noticed markings on the walls, faint sketches of faces and figures that appeared to be observing the space even in absence, their expressions frozen between sorrow and warning. The house seemed to remember, and its memory was not kind. It was filled with the minutiae of life and death, the careful arrangements of objects, and the hidden corners that spoke of fear, secrecy, and survival. She found letters tucked between floorboards, brittle and yellowed, written in an unfamiliar hand, but full of urgency, regret, and fear. The words hinting at events she could not yet understand but could feel in the hollow ache of her chest. Every step, every turn, every room brought a new revelation, a deeper understanding that the house's history was layered and complex, a repository of human emotion and experience that had survived the decades in silence. She could sense the presence of those who had shaped the space, a residue of lives lived in secrecy and tension, of hopes that had been quietly nurtured and then abandoned. It was not merely haunted in the way stories claimed, with ghosts wandering aimlessly. The house was alive in memory and intention, and she, with her own long history of endurance, was the only one who could perceive the full depth of what had been left behind. The objects, the carvings, the hidden spaces, the preserved belongings all pointed to a narrative that she had only begun to understand, a narrative that connected her to the past in ways that went beyond explanation, beyond logic, beyond the kind of fear one could simply name or confront. The further she delved into the rooms, the more she realized that the house's emptiness was an illusion, that nothing inside was truly gone, and that the shadows she saw were not random, but deliberate, moving in response to her presence, guiding her attention, revealing the details she needed to see. The widow had begun to sense that the house was not merely a shelter but a repository of hidden truths, a place where the past lingered with a will of its own, refusing to release what it had once claimed. She moved through the dimly lit corridors with a caution born of decades spent surviving threats both seen and unseen, her senses heightened by years of instinct and wariness. Every corner she passed seemed to whisper fragments of conversations, echoes of footsteps, murmurs that might have belonged to the family who vanished or to the servants and workers whose labor had filled the house long ago. The air carried a weight she could not measure, a mixture of dust, age, and something else, something alive in memory if not in flesh. The rooms were filled with evidence of lives interrupted, objects left in mid-use, chairs pushed back as if the occupants had risen suddenly and never returned, and books opened to pages that hinted at knowledge someone had not wished to forget. She could feel the presence of history pressing in on her from all sides, a constant reminder that the house had not been idle while the world moved on. As she explored, she found a small, hidden closet behind a false panel in the wall, the kind of space only someone intimately familiar with the house's secrets would know to create. Inside, she discovered remnants of journals and ledgers, carefully stacked and tied with fraying ribbons, filled with names and dates, records of events that were both mundane and sinister. The handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive, as though the person who wrote it had labored under the weight of urgency or fear, compelled to preserve every detail against loss. Some entries described ordinary domestic life, yet others hinted at darker practices, secret dealings, and alliances that had long been buried beneath polite society's veneer. She realized with a growing sense of unease that the house had been a witness to more than she could have imagined, and that its memory extended far beyond walls and floors, into the moral and emotional landscapes of those who had lived and died within it. In the attic, she uncovered trunks filled with clothing, personal effects, and objects wrapped in cloth, some smelling faintly of herbs and decay, others preserved with care, their purpose opaque but deliberate. There were masks and figurines, carved with precision and bearing symbols that seemed almost ritualistic, and she felt a shiver of recognition, as if the items were not meant for decoration but for observation, for preservation, for something she could not yet name. She traced her fingers over the carvings, noting patterns that appeared repeatedly in hidden corners of the house, on doors, on shelves, even scratched into the beams above. The repetition was deliberate, a message encoded into the structure itself, one that required patience and attention to discern. The more she examined, the more she realized that the house had been designed to record memory, to hold on to events that the outside world preferred to forget, and to leave clues for anyone capable of perceiving them. But she felt compelled to open it, her fingers tracing the delicate patterns as though reading a language written in symbols and silence. Inside were letters, photographs, and objects that seemed intimately connected to her own history, items she could not have known existed but that resonated with experiences she carried deep in her memory. The realization struck her that the house had been waiting for her in ways she had never anticipated, leaving pieces of a puzzle scattered through its rooms, challenging her to assemble them, to understand what had been hidden, and to confront the truths embedded in the fabric of the place. Even as she examined the objects and inscriptions, she became aware of the subtle movements around her, shadows shifting just beyond the reach of her candlelight, the floor settling with soft groans as if in acknowledgement of her presence, the faint scent of smoke or incense lingering in the corners. It was as if the house itself were responding to her, guiding her attention, revealing secrets selectively, choosing what to show and what to withhold. She felt both fear and fascination, a tension that was both thrilling and suffocating. The house had been abandoned to the outside world, yes, but it had never truly been empty. Every object, every mark, every hidden space was alive with the memory of the people who had shaped it. and she was now part of that continuum, drawn into its narrative by her presence and by the weight of her own history. Her understanding of the house grew with each passing hour. She realized that what others had called neglect was, in fact, a form of preservation, that the dust and decay were not signs of abandonment, but a cloak for truths that could not survive exposure. The house demanded respect, attention, and patience, and she approached each discovery with care, feeling the presence of unseen watchers in the shifting light and the stillness of the rooms, aware that she was not merely uncovering history, but being drawn into it, becoming part of a story that had waited decades to continue. As the widow continued to explore the abandoned house, a growing sense of recognition began to settle over her, a feeling that the walls themselves were aware of her presence, that the very air remembered her life in ways she had never imagined possible. The house had been silent for decades, yet in its quiet she could perceive echoes of the past, subtle shifts in the shadows, faint impressions of footsteps that were not her own, and the lingering scent of belongings long since left behind. Each room seemed to hold a story, and as she walked through them, she felt a strange intimacy with those who had come before, a connection that transcended the years and the suffering she had endured. It was as though the house had been waiting not just for anyone, but for her, someone whose life had been marked by pain and endurance, someone capable of understanding the weight of memory that the place carried. In the parlor, she discovered objects that were at once ordinary and deeply unsettling. Furniture arranged as if its owners had simply stepped away, a tea set placed meticulously on a table with cups still aligned, and photographs that, though faded, captured expressions frozen in time. Some faces in the pictures were unfamiliar, yet she could feel the intensity of their lives radiating through the paper, as if the subjects were aware of her scrutiny and silently urging her to understand. Behind the fireplace, she found hidden compartments containing letters and notes, some written in hands she did not recognize, others in scripts that seemed oddly familiar, filled with coded references, names, and events that hinted at secrets spanning generations. The realization struck her that the house was not only a physical space, but also a record, a meticulous archive of experiences, some mundane, others deeply sinister, preserved in ways intended to endure beyond the lifespans of those who had created them. Descending the narrow staircase to the basement, she encountered rooms that felt more like shrines than storage areas. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars, boxes, and artifacts whose purpose was unclear yet undeniably significant. Symbols and markings adorned the surfaces, some etched into wood, others painted faintly onto stone, creating a network of hidden messages that seemed to speak directly to her. The air was thick with the smell of earth, decay, and a faint, unplaceable fragrance that brought tears to her eyes, a scent she associated with long-lost memories of her childhood and the fields where she had labored. She realized that this place had not simply been abandoned by its previous owners. It had been carefully curated, preserved with intention, its secrets organized for discovery by someone with the patience and insight to perceive them. Throughout her exploration, she encountered objects that seemed impossibly tied to her own past, items she could not have known existed yet, that resonated with intimate knowledge of her life. A small, worn box contained trinkets that triggered memories she had long suppressed. A piece of fabric matching one she had worn in youth, a carved token she had once owned, and scraps of paper with markings that mirrored those she had seen in her own journals. Each discovery was accompanied by a growing sense of unease and revelation, as if the house itself was revealing a narrative that had been deliberately woven to lead her toward understanding. She felt simultaneously a sense of dread and an urgent compulsion to continue, unable to stop even as the weight of the revelations pressed down upon her, heavy and insistent. In the upper floors, she found more evidence of life carefully preserved, including books with margins filled with notes and sketches that hinted at rituals, events, and occurrences that seemed at once private and universal. The windows, though cracked and clouded with dust, allowed sunlight to filter in just enough to illuminate the carvings and inscriptions that adorned the walls. Some were crude, some elegant, but all suggested deliberate intent, as if the previous occupants had sought to communicate across time, leaving traces that would survive the decay of wood and plaster. The widow realized that the house's memory was not merely physical, it was moral and emotional, preserving intention, experience, and consequence in ways that defied ordinary understanding. As she wandered from room to room, she felt the house respond to her presence in subtle but unmistakable ways. Doors that had seemed jammed now moved easily under her touch. Shadows shifted to reveal hidden corners, and faint sounds echoed through the halls as though guiding her toward discoveries she had not anticipated. She understood that the house was not simply a passive vessel but an active participant in her journey, shaping her experience, revealing its secrets selectively, and forcing her to confront truths that extended beyond ordinary fear or curiosity. Each object, each marking, each hidden space carried meaning, demanding attention, interpretation, and respect. She began to recognize that the shocking truth the house held was tied directly to her own history, to the decades she had survived, and to the chains she had endured. The discoveries were not random. They were connected to her life in ways she could not yet fully articulate, as if the house remembered her long before she had returned. The deeper she delved into its rooms, the more she felt the weight of the past pressing toward her, urging her to understand the connections between herself and the previous occupants, between her suffering and the secrets preserved in the walls. The house had waited silently, deliberately, its memory carefully curated, and its purpose aligned with her arrival, and she began to realize that what she found inside would forever alter her understanding of her own life, of the history she had survived, and of the haunting persistence of human memory.